in the United States, and it usually is said in the context of marriage, that if you both agree on everything, one of you is unnecessary. I'm imperfect. I don't have to hide my imperfections. I can talk about what irritates me and bothers me, and which of course means that I'm a small person when small things irritate me. But my friend knows that about me, and it's already been forgiven. The most self-centered things we can do is to see a friend in need, and even in that moment, decide that we are more important than our friend, and to keep up the pretense of a friendship rather than actually acting as a friend.
Says the joy of saints is the death of a friend, one no longer in danger of being broken or corrupted.
Yeah, there's joy in that. But I miss my dad.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, viewers and listeners of Freedom for All's podcast. In today's episode, we are back to the subject of theology. And this is actually episode 50, so a bit of a jubilee episode. And with me, joining us from San Diego, California, correct me if I'm wrong, Jerry, is a special guest of ours with whom we'll delve into the topic of friendship. So let me introduce to all of you Pastor Джери Андрюс, PhD, Senior Pastor Emeritus of the First Presbyterian Church in San Diego, who serves as a director on the board of Theology Matters. Pastor Andrews, hello. Thank you for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure.
Hello.
Have you?
I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
My pleasure, 100%. So today we will talk on the subject of friendship through the prism of St. Augustine's writings and an excellent treatise by Pastor Andrews, published on Theology Matters website. We will leave a link in the comment section in the description of the video. I absolutely encourage all of our viewers to read the article. It's brilliant, very thought-provoking. And the perspective and some of the ideas that we will tackle in our conversation are frankly very challenging. I found some of them very challenging. Jerry, particularly, even from a generic Christian point of view, that is, let alone from a worldly point of view. So one such concept that I can mention would be the idea that a saint can find joy in the death of a friend. I struggle with that idea a lot, but we can cover that in a little while in more detail. So let's jump straight in. In your piece, Pastor Andrews, you place a lot of emphasis on the definition of friendship, which personally, I'm a big fan of defining words and concepts before delving into the realm of ideas. So according to St. Augustine, that is, the definition that you've quoted a few times in the article is originally Cicero's definition of friendship, which states friendship is nothing other than agreement on all things divine and human, along with goodwill and affection. Why did Augustine settle on this definition?
He always favored Cicero. That was his favorite pagan author, if you will. And he thought Cicero to be wise. Plus, Cicero had written an essay, a treatise on friendship. It's rare to do so. There were more than one. He wasn't the only one. But his probably had the widest circulation. And so it was easy for Augustine to borrow that. And it's, I want to say, a kind of an obvious definition. You think of two people, maybe more, who are in agreement, not absolutely and not on all things, but who are in agreement, who think about life in similar ways and pursue wisdom in similar ways. And the nature of their relationship is not just the commonality. There's goodwill, trust, and there's affection between the two. So there's a sense of, I call it shoulder to shoulder and face to face, that there's a common project of learning the truth, of going about life together. So you're shoulder to shoulder facing the world. And then there's this, the added element of goodwill and affection. And that's face to face. That's true in marriage. You know, you're raising children, that shoulder to shoulder. You're building a household. You're building a life and a family, and making contribution in your generation to your church and to your city and to your world. That's shoulder to shoulder. But marriage is also very much face to face. It's two people whose affection towards one another excels that of affection for others. And he defines friendship that way. Again, it seems to be kind of a basic one, and use that definition often, and talks about having used it exclusively before his conversion and even a little bit after his conversion. Then, when he was writing his Confessions, which is a narrative, a lot of it about friendship, he changed his definition. He added agreement on all things human and divine, with goodwill and affection in Christ Jesus, that both needed to be followers of Jesus for this to be a full and therefore a true friendship. And some of the, I want to say most revealing and a little bit difficult to read sometimes are some of his letters to people after he converted. Many of his friends converted about the time he did, but not all. And he had this wide circle of childhood friends that he stayed in touch with, one of whom became, Macarius, became uh, one of the most important people in North Africa.
Right.
And they talked about when he got sent back to North Africa, the renewal of their friendship and all that. But then in a long, carefully written, I think difficult letter, he says, you know, we weren't actually friends when we were young because we weren't followers of Jesus together. Yes, there was agreement, but frankly, we were wrong about things human and things divine. So that doesn't count. Agreement on it has to be also agreement with the truth of the matter. And neither one of us were. And then I had a conversion and you didn't. And so, you know, in that period, we weren't really friends. But now that you've converted, and
Yes.
he's
So
actually
sorry, I'll
encouraging,
just fire up the quote from the article, the exact words
right?
that you see. It really says, "I really did not have you as a friend until we were bound in Christ." It's very harsh, Jerry.
Yes, well, you're very quick about that. So, um, yeah, that's hard to say. Can you go down to the very end of the letter? And then I think you really catch Augustine's heart on this matter, the way it hit the last two sentences of it to him. So though he says we weren't friends then, but now we are friends, he says, you're my oldest friend, which means he didn't discount the affection that they shared and the
Right.
experiences they had when they were kids. Of course they were friends, but he's elevated friendship, the definition of it, to a very formal status, in an aspirational status, and said only now can you and I achieve that goal.
Yes.
So uh, there's the warmth of a real man, Augustine, with what you and I would think of, or at least I do, is almost enviable group of friends that stayed together most of their life. That's enviable. My oldest friends, well, other than family members and cousins and things, my oldest friends, a couple from my high school youth group at my church,
Yes.
and some from seminary when I attended seminary in my 20s. Not from my childhood. All those friends are gone. I grew up in the city of Detroit in America, and Detroit went through a lot of changes. In the neighborhood that I grew up in really doesn't exist anymore, and nobody
Mm.
lives in the neighborhood anymore.
Yep.
Um, I went to a high school with 1,000 people in my graduating class, 4,000 people in high school, and we have a reunion and 50 people show up. That's that's all that are still somewhere in the area. So, but he had this enviable group. They traveled a lot. They did a lot of things together. But he will become so persuaded by the grace of God that that changes everything. It will change friendship in his definition of it as well. And then with the new definition, he reinvests in friendships with his friends, many of whom also, like him, get ordained, some of whom, like him, become bishops.
All right. Shall we look into the definition more closely, please, so that we can disseminate it word by word? I would like us to do that, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
Because last week, in fact, I was at a youth
Yes.
uh, group. I often mentioned it in our prior conversation before before we started recording the podcast episode. So this is the quote that we're looking at, and at that youth group that I mentioned, we seem to all, to a different degree, disagree with Augustine's definition somewhat, because I'll give you a personal example that I gave at that conversation. I do have a friend, well, a worldly friend that I've had for more than 25 years. I've been with that friend of mine ever since primary school, from the first grade onwards. So more than 25 years of friendship. He's not a believer of Christ. I am. So in theory, we do have a different definition of things divine and things human. I value every human being as created in God's image and God's liking. So there is an inherent value in every human being. They've got a soul, they've got a body, and then there's a spirit. He doesn't believe that. And then again, the whole divine part of the reality, he completely ignores that. But still, we do have a lot of kindness and affection to each other. We like spending time together. We like talking about different subjects and contemplating them and arguing on them as well. So in a sense, it's what in the previous quote that we talked about, what you emphasized on, he's still an old friend of mine. I mean, it might not be a perfect definition of friendship, but still a friend. What are your thoughts on that? And would you like to expand on the definition that Augustine presents, please?
Yeah, I think when we made reference to the letter to Macarius, that yes, there has to be an acknowledgement that kindness and affection are not do not require agreement, and just the opposite. There are folks with whom you agree, with whom they're not your natural friends.
Yes.
I'll cite as an example for me. I'm a member of the Presbyterian Church in the United States, and it's a big, broad, mainline denomination, and there are differences of opinion, sometimes fairly severe differences of opinion within the one denomination. Yet part of our ordination vows are that we will relate to each other as colleagues in ministry, our colleagues in ministry as friends. Part of that is just to act friendly. That's kind of a basic minimum, to be civil, to be kind, to
Right.
believe the best about somebody with whom you disagree rather than the worst, not to pick fights, just good Christian manners. But it also means to be friends. And so a friend of mine who, on many matters before the church, I'm in disagreement with, we decided that we would gather people that would agree. I have a team, if you will, of seven, and he has a team of seven, and we would meet a couple times a year and spend time together, thinking and praying together about matters before the church, knowing at the very beginning of the conversation, we're not going to end up in the same place. We're not going to be in agreement about this. The differences between us are long-standing and fairly deep.
Sure.
But yet, this is what friends do. Friends spend time with each other. Friends talk. It won't solve all of our problems, but I don't know how we solve our problems without being friendly toward one another and making friends of one another. So that agreement, in order to have kindness and affection, is misplaced. But what Augustine experiences and what Cicero experienced were people who were spent a great deal of time pursuing the truth. What you're doing on this podcast, what you're doing with your work with Freedom for All, that there's a mission here. It's to know the truth, to tell the truth, to live out the truth. So it's not casual. We're not simply neighbors and living near one another or working in the same business together and so have contact and do so in a friendly manner and enjoy each other's company. There's this added part that you're on the mission of pursuing what's good and right and true together. And hence the idea of agreement on all things human and divine. Well, in the
Right.
same way, I think an illustration would be Paul's advice to us that when we marry someone who also is a follower of Jesus and is a committed Christian. Not that you can't have a marriage without it. I mean, sometimes neither one are Christian and one converts. It's still a marriage and still to be respected. But that difference, because there's a disagreement on who Jesus is and the foundational matters of truth, um, it's not that it makes the marriage harder. It might. It's that it makes part of it impossible because you don't share that part.
Mm.
Let's say a wife converts. Neither had been Christian when they married, and she converts. He does not. You can't raise your children together in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. You don't. You raise your children together, but you are not both leading them toward Christ. Only one of you is doing that. So it's just unshared. So it's that kind of thinking that makes Augustine and Cicero put in first place this agreement on all things human and divine. That people who are in a similar pursuit and have some mutual recognition of what's good and right and true. And then you add to that the warmth, the kindness, the affection, and that's friendship.
Right.
But can I say a minor friendship? You can be friends with somebody because you share the same sports team, and so you go to the same European football, American soccer. You go to the same match. You root for the same team. You share that. You're in agreement. You want your team to win, and you know who the good guys are. You know who the bad guys are. This is not the most important thing in life, but it can be passionate, and you share it. That can be a friendship. Now, it's not about all of life, and Augustine's talking about all of life, but it is a friendship on that part of agreement.
Right. That makes sense. So affection and goodwill could be separated from the mutual agreement on all things divine and human in a sense.
We
Well,
have a saying in the United States, and it usually is said in the context of marriage, that if you both agree on everything, one of you is unnecessary.
makes sense
And
as well.
I don't know if you're married or your experience of marriage, but agreement on all things is not possible.
Yes, I'm not married myself, but I do have experience with women. I know what you
Okay.
mean. And thank you. So if we expand a bit the definition of friendship and we go over the section called defining friendships of grace in your article, I believe that's what it was called. There you list a few different characteristics of what friendship in Christ entails. I would like us to go over a few of them. So I will share my screen and we can start with honesty. So this is the excerpt from your article. Let me zoom in a little bit. Under the paragraph for honesty, you say the following. What he expects in the absence of full self-knowledge, which is the definition of humility in my mind, is frankness and openness, a willingness to speak the truth as best we know it and to live in full view of one another. The virtue beneath this honesty is truth. A person must be a friend of truth before they can be a friend to any human being. And in a sense, this is expanding on what you just talked about, how there needs to be the ground layer, the foundation of us being driven by the same principle, seeking truth and all these good and honest and beautiful in life. Is that what
Yes.
Augustine
Yeah.
means by this?
Yeah. I think it works both ways. This is about a common pursuit of truth and being truthful about yourself with the other. And I think for many people, if you were to ask them their definition, they would recognize that a friend is somebody that I can be me with. And yeah, I'm imperfect. I don't have to hide my imperfections. I can talk about what irritates me and bothers me, and which of course means that I'm a small person when small things irritate me. But my friend knows that about me, and it's already been forgiven. It's not my friend. It's not as my friend doesn't understand that that's a fault in me. My friend understands that. My friend understands what's small in me, and he sees my fears. He sees where I could be better and don't have the courage to do that, yet forgives that. One statement that I've heard is that a friend is someone who knows you as you truly are and has no plans for your improvement. That just accepts that. Think about the way that Jesus drew in Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector, um, and then asked the two of them. For all we know, he matched the two of them when they went into the villages two by two. Well, these two people have almost nothing in common except Jesus, and they respond to the world very differently. One is an agent of the Romans. One is an adversary of the Romans. Could be violent even, but they're on the same team because they follow Jesus. So it's that being honest with each other. And I think many people would say, I know who my friends are because that's the person that I don't have to put on a facade. I don't have to put on a front. I don't have to pretend to be other than what I am, knowing that we might use the word safe, but I'd be safe there. I won't be accused. The person knows. And can I say as a pastor, it's what I need to model to my congregation. Hard as that is, because I'm the pastor, I always want to be the strong person and they're the weak person. And so I'm there to help them. And I'm comfortable with that. It's difficult when roles are reversed because when they're facing a surgery and I visit them the day before or in their home, um, if they are afraid, just afraid that they might not survive this or that their health will never be regained, I want them to be honest with me about that. I
Yes.
don't want them to pretend and say, "Oh, I know that God heals, and um, I know that all will be well because God is for us, and I don't have any fears." When they are afraid, I want them to know that they can say they're afraid, and what they won't get from me is, "Oh, you shouldn't be afraid," in a lecture. What they will get from me is understanding. It can be frightening to have surgery, and prayers. That's what they'll get from me. They'll get friendship in return.
Mm.
Um, uh, that that's an important part of being true, being honest with one another. And it's required again in a marriage, simply because whether you intend to reveal it or not, your marriage partner will figure this out about you. They will know what you're afraid of and what you're not. Better to be honest with yourself. I think he says truthfulness is pursuing the truth together and being truthful with one another. Somewhere in there is also should be the self-examination to know the truth about
Yes.
yourself, to know when I'm afraid and when I'm not. Um, Wife of 47 years, she knows these things about me. Our marriage is better when I know these things about me and verbalize it and I'm honest about it in front of her.
Mm. And these aspects that you talk about, they're very they're driven by Christ, and He's the great example that He shows us these qualities in a man. So unconditional love, unconditional acceptance of the other. And I love the example that you gave with Simon Zealot and Matthew, because they're as radical in two different extremes on the political ideological spectrum as you can get, much more polarized than Democrats and Republicans in the US at the moment, in my perspective at least.
Mm-hmm.
They're united, but something grander than all of that. And your comment on self-examination naturally leads me to the other characteristic that I wanted us to quickly talk about, and that is under the section called love, where you say, let me just find the actual quote. It is hard work for the temptation to sin. The temptations to sin are, where is it? Are fewer than the temptations to avoid correcting the friend who sins. The friend is more important than friendship. Do not risk the first for the sake of the latter. So it is this part here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the hard part. That's the hard work. And that makes my earlier comment about not having plans to improve should be put aside. Where let me give I'll give an illustration. Um, we have three children. They're different from one another and how they were raised, but in their teens, teenagers are teenagers, and the youngest one, the one who's most like me in some ways, um, did something that was um, life threatening. It was dangerous. And when I discovered it, we had a good relationship, honest. I said, I believe this to be the fact. And is it so? And she said, yes. And I said, well, then you've lost some freedom because I can't give you the freedom to maybe make that mistake again. I can't. Now, we had a friendship. You want to be friends with your teenage kids. You want to hear what they're thinking. And you're not the first person they want to talk to normally. And so I was glad for our closeness. I knew when I did that I was signaling to her that I didn't trust her. Because the fact of the matter is, in this part of life, I no longer trusted her because of a bad decision. I didn't trust her on that. And in taking away some freedom, I was announcing that. And she knew it and I knew it. That part of our friendship was going to come to an end. And that it was going to cost me more than cost her. That this was in my heart this was a big loss to me. And I knew I was going to lose, but my job wasn't the friendship. My job was the friend. My job was to get her safely through her teens. My job was to see her prosper. My assignment as her friend, as her parent, is to make sure the good comes out of her and happens to her. My job was not to protect the friendship. So there was some sacrifice of that in order to get, well, that's an uneven relationship, parent and child. But it's also true in friends that um, a good friend to me is somebody who can sit down and say, Jerry, I was watching what you said there and what you did. Jerry, do you think that's you at your best? Do you do you think there was another way that or someone say, Jerry, I've seen you in that circumstance before, and frankly, you did better. This time, not so well. Um, maybe you want to think about amending how you go about this now. That's what a friend does, or for the sake of the friend. It it may put the friendship at risk for a moment. Can I reverse it? A youth director, when I was a teenager in high school, somebody I once spent a lot of time with. He's older, and so I want to spend a lot of time with him. And he would say to me, Jerry, you're bright. You ask hard questions. It takes me. You think of a question in a second, and it takes me a whole week to find the answer. We come back and we talk about it. But Jerry, you never commit. I think your questions are just a postponement technique so that you don't have to commit. And when he said that, I knew instantly he was right. And I was mad at him that, thanks be to God, he knew me that well. And thanks be to God, he had the courage to tell me the truth, which quite frankly was his job. But also part of his job was to befriend the teenagers. And he put that friendship at risk. For all he know, I was going to say, well, then never mind, and walk away and seek the counsel of somebody else, maybe somebody who wasn't a Christian. But that was also the moment that I went away and thought, well, he's right about that. I know I have to make a decision sooner or later, and I'm postponing it because becoming a follower of Christ publicly will require some change of life for me. And and that's a hard thing. Nobody wants to do it. I don't want to do it. But we had a friendship, and he in that moment decided the friend, me, was more important than the friendship.
Yes.
And that's a hard thing to do. So yeah, the temptation is greater to avoid that than to fail to affirm a friend when they've done well.
That leads us back to Proverbs 27:17. I was talking about that with a lady friend of mine the other day. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. So there are sparks flying, there is friction. It hurts, it's painful. But it's through goodwill and affection, isn't it? Because if you truly care about the person on the other end, you need to tell them the truth, because there is
Yes.
no love without truth, and there is no truth without love. There was a saying like that. It goes that way. Um, but nowadays, especially particularly in the West, it's very well easy to go the other way. To be Because a lot of society and the media and the education system is emphasizing on that we need to be tolerant and we need to be very well inoffensive. So because we might offend the other person when we say the truth, even if it's about very obvious problems, not even from a Christian point of view, but even generic things in life that are common sense and they're wrong and they're hurting somebody else, but we should keep quiet. We are encouraged to do that all the time. So this task becomes even more. So Jerry, how do we navigate between what the world tells us, meaning be quiet, don't offend, don't speak the truth, and our mandate from Christ to speak the truth in love? How do we walk that line?
Yeah. Let me say, if it were easy, more people would do it. I think it's a hard thing. Uh, Part of what makes it difficult are some difficulties we should be able to put aside. Uh, Being afraid of what the reaction might be. If we care deeply about the friend, we want the best for the friend. And if they don't see themselves as they ought, and they don't see the world around them as they ought, and they're headed for harm, we owe it to them, in the name of our friendship, to warn, to encourage them to change. Um, and yes, the reason why we wouldn't do it would be, I think, for the most part, for fear the person would break off the friendship. But Augustine, well, and other places tell us, well, then he would counsel me and say, so, Jerry, what kind of a friendship do you have? If you can't be honest with your friend, if you can't help your friend in his time of need in a way, he can't help himself because he doesn't recognize the truth. What kind of a friendship do you have? And that what makes it bearable to be corrected by another person in a friendship is that it's mutual. Augustine will talk about sometimes the first person will need to speak in loving but truthful ways to the second for the benefit of the second person. And then on another occasion, it's the second person who needs to do that for the first. And that is what, and if I'm the second person, if I'm the person being corrected, Instead of thinking my only option, self-preservation, is to get away from this person who's lording it over me, is when I'm reminded that there was another time when I thought harm was going to come my friend's way, and I gave a warning, a correction, advice about amending his life. And he accepted that. This is not lording it over me. This is actually coming underneath me and serving me. That's what's happening here. That's not hard to understand. It's hard to do. Not, but it's not all that common in friendships. You do it in parenting. Parents do this instinctually. You correct the child for the sake of the child. And yes, the child rebels against it. But because of the nature of it, the parent-child relationship isn't broken. So we're afraid of losing the friendship, so we don't attend to the need of the friend for some correction. And you're reciting the world. What is right about it is if that's all the friendship is, it's mutual correction, then you don't have a friend. You have a personal trainer. You've gone to the gym and somebody who's very, very fit is yelling at me, who's not very fit, about everything I should be doing. It's all one way. That's not a friendship. I mean, it's for my benefit, but it's not a friendship. In a friendship, this is something that you can do mutually because you both have been honest with one another. And yeah, usually someone has gone first because they needed to. I'm recalling one now where he was an admiral in the United States Navy, a man younger than me. This was not long ago. And he talked to me about a great need that was hidden from everyone. And he honored me as his pastor in doing that, which permitted me to become more honest with him. This is somebody that I trusted. I trusted with the truth about me, and that he wouldn't miss the opportunity to give me the correction and encouragement I needed because he had received it from me.
Sure.
And so we were able to go on. But yes, there's the world is self-centered. One of the most self-centered things we can do is to see a friend in need, and even in that moment, decide that we are more important than our friend, and to keep up the pretense of a friendship rather than actually acting as a friend becomes more important because, well, I love me more than I love you. That's the world.
Yes, the temptations to sin are fewer than the temptations to avoid correcting the friend who sins. Augustine is spot on with that one. It's very relevant nowadays. And
Think
expanding.
about the
Yep.
think about the story that if your listeners know any story from Augustine's Confession, they know the story about the pear tree. And he and some friends, he tells us this story in a section in which he wants to tell us about his friendships. Yes, we learned something about what Augustine believes about the sinful nature of a human being, but it's in a section where he's talking about his friendship. And he's with a group of guys. He's not the leader. In all of his childhood and early youth friendships, Augustine is not the first person. Later in life, when it's about being a bishop, he will take the lead in his group, but not when he's young. And he's influenced by them. And what they did was they hopped a fence. I'm going to guess they're about 12. They hop a fence late at night, um, harvest a whole bunch of pears, take bites out of the pear, therefore ruining them, and throwing them on the ground or throwing them to the pigs. And he confesses, we didn't even like pears. I don't like pears. This wasn't about pleasure. It'd be easy to understand why we did it if this was for our benefit, but we don't even like pears. What we wanted to have happen is the imagination in our head that in the morning the owner would come out of his home, see what we did to his orchard, and be angry and distressed. And the thought of that brought us pleasure.
Mm.
And so then he begins to reflect on himself. And he says, so I'm capable of that, just doing the wrong thing, just in order to do the wrong thing. Yes. And then he says, would I have done this without my friends? No, I wouldn't have done it. I wouldn't have had enough daring. And it was about making fun of somebody, about laughter, and people seldom laugh alone. But my friends are not to blame for this. This was in me, and they called it out. They called it forward. And he will use that after his conversion to want that to be reversed. That the good that God has placed in us is to be called out by the friend, helping each other to be at our bests. Um, Sometimes by modeling it, often enough by calling for it. But he'll also say in that statement that everybody who did this knew this was wrong. Nobody was mistaken. Nobody was confused about the morals of it. It's wrong to hop a fence. It's wrong to steal pears. It's wrong to ruin the pears and waste them. It's wrong to torment the orchard owner. They all knew it was wrong, but not one of them could say to the other, let's not do this because it's wrong. Instead, Augustine says, and he calls it the unfriendly friendship.
Yes.
Oh, unfriendly friendship, that uh, provokes me to do something wrong simply by saying, let's do it. Nobody had to talk, no boy had to talk another boy into this. All they had to say was, let's do it. And they did it.
He uses very strong language in
Yes.
that section. He says, "Oh, unfriendly friendship, you inscrutable seducer of the soul, you avid appetite to do damage to the other out of sheer sport and silliness without gain or glory, you with merely the word, hey, let's do it, make us ashamed not to be shameful." And what struck me the most in your retelling of that story, in your commentary, is where Augustine recounts that story in Confessions, he says at one point, "I cannot bear to think of this any longer."
After all that, he does that a couple of times. He does that when he talks about the death of his friend, too. He goes so much deeper than any other ancient into self-examination. What moved me? What provoked that movement in me? What was in me that got moved? He's just, his biographer, Peter Brown, says this about him, that he's just more shrewd than anyone else in thinking about themselves. He understands what the human heart does, both for good and for evil. He understands the human heart. He's shrewd about it, wise about it. And so he talks about this um, unfriendly friendship, and then talks about friendship and how much it can provoke each other to do. But he'll in this knowing his own heart and therefore projecting a human heart to human heart, your heart has to be somewhat like mine. Um, it's in thinking about that Augustine as a theologian will triumph because he sees no help for the human heart in the human heart. It's not a self-correcting mechanism. It can do evil simply by another person saying, "Hey, let's do it." It's 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 capable of being that thoughtless, and often is. So when you and so his doctrine's about grace, that there has to be a divine intervention. I don't get better by trying harder. I get more frustrated by trying harder. I begin to make improvements as a human being and become more and more conformed to the image of Christ by the grace of God. That this is a gift, not something that I've earned. And that is, we think of him as the doctor of grace. That's what makes Augustine the theologian for the whole church through the ages. his insight into the necessity of grace because of the human heart's predicament. So we appreciate the confessions. Yeah, first reading. And when the world reads the confessions, they go, it's a 12-year-old boy and he stole some pears and took a bite out of them and had a laugh and moved on. And good grief. For all the world's troubles, he's troubled by that. Uh, Augustine sees no difference in that. In somebody who starts a war, just to start a war, who's a leader of a country, who's told by his generals, hey, there's another country, they're weak, we can take them, so let's do it. He sees no difference in that. The scale is much greater, and the harm much greater and irreversible. But it's the same human heart that hops the fence and steals the pear. And it's that human heart that needs to be uh, healed, that needs to be rescued.
And it's what you refer to in your article as, well, you say that Confessions introduces a new literary form, and that's exactly that psychological self-examination, the depth into which Augustine delves.
Yes. I was making a comment on he leaves the story by saying, I can't think about it anymore. I don't know if underneath that statement it's because it's too painful to go further. Or remember, he's writing the Confessions 10 years after his conversion. He's already a bishop. And the first 9 books are talking about his life. Then there's a 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th book. And in the 10th, he talks about his life now as a bishop. And he's admitting that boy who stole that pear, he didn't go completely away. He's still in here.
Painful.
Yeah, and the reason why I can recall it with so vividly and so truly is because it's still here and I can see it.
That's painful nuance there, Jerry. Very
Yes.
painful. Because I know I've got it in my heart as well. I know it for a fact. Talking about true friendship, and let's tackle the most, well, the subject that I'm most struggling with myself, the one that I alluded to in the introduction of our conversation. Augustine's quote that says, "The joy of saints is the death of a friend, one no longer in danger of being broken or corrupted." So I intellectually understand where that is coming from. Potentially partly in my spirit, I understand it as well. Now, I'll tell you a short personal story of mine. In my first year as a student in the north of England, in the university at the University of Huddersfield, where I did do journalism, I went into a Baptist church, so I became part of the congregation there. And within a couple of weeks of my 18-year-old self joining the congregation, I was invited by a lady, an 80-plus-year-old lady, to attend her husband's funeral. So her husband that she had been married to for 40 plus years. And so at that time I was very, well, I wasn't very experienced socially, none the least in the English language. So I was shy and I did not know how to act in that sort of a situation. Nobody has ever invited me to a funeral, let alone an English lady in the north of England. So I said, well, my condolences when I went to the actual funeral. And she was genuinely surprised at me expressing my condolences. She said, "What for?" And to which I became even more confused and insecure. And I said, "Well, you were at your husband's funeral, so I'm expressing my condolences." And she said, "Oh, he's at a better place now. He's with my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. He's in the eternal place of happiness and joy, etc. You should be sorry for me because I still have a few more years to live on this earth before I join him." To which I was dumbfounded, because that level of faith and realizing, well, what reality is about, and obviously the unseen world is the much more real reality than the material world. really. And when I think about that, I still struggle with that thought, because if I contemplate a dear friend of mine dying, I'm not a fan of that idea. I can't really say from the bottom of my heart, truthfully, that I would find joy in the death of a friend, even though I would know that he's no longer in the danger of being broken or corrupted. What sort of level of sanctity one must get in order to attain that level that Augustine talks about, I wonder.
Um, I think I want to say three things. I hope I remember all three. When he says that, he knows he's being provocative. That's not a common response to the death of a friend. He did not rejoice in his mother's death. He records her death and his reaction to it. The death of his friend when he was young is a powerful, powerful part of, I think it's book 4, but a powerful part of that. They're both in their first teaching assignment. I think they're about 20. They're best friends, and the friend dies. And he is so grief stricken. He wanders about the town. It was the town of their birth, the small town, and he could find no comfort in the places that he would be alone and his friend wasn't there. Prior to that, the place would say to him, "Don't worry, he's coming." Now could no longer say that. And that the grief lasted so long, he thought about dying to be with his friend and to decide to stay alive, because in that way, in some way, his friend could stay alive. And all these grief, this is before his conversion, but all this grief. And then he said, because I could find no comfort there, I left and went to Carthage. And that's the end of the story. As if there was no closure. It's that incident he will comment on twice later in his letters and say, I'm not proud of my response. Well, it was hopeless. It's Paul saying we don't grieve like those who have no hope. We grieve. I think that means, therefore, we grieve, but not like those who have no hope. One of the differences I try to teach my congregation is you don't grieve for them. There can be a sadness. There can be people who die young and therefore too early, if you will, at least in our minds. And there's a grief for them that they didn't get to live the full life. But when my father died, uh, we were very close. He was he wanted to be with Jesus. He hadn't been. He was in his 80s, and up till the last half of his year life, he had been in fairly good health. I was a construction worker, and was robust, and that had begun to fail. But he wanted to be with Jesus. He wanted to be with Jesus when he was 20. And he knew that was the next great thing. So we lived, Detroit is home, and I live in California. And so my sister called and took an overnight flight and was with my dad. And he was in the hospital. He was dying. And I said to my father, my sister and I, we've got mom, we've got her covered. All of her needs will be taken care of. You provided for her. We will continue to provide for her. All is well here. And he died, thinking that his work was done and what he wanted was to be with Jesus. Well, okay, if I want to honor my father truly, and I do, if he wants to be with Jesus, am I to begrudge him that? Can't I find some joy in he's run the course, he's run well, he finished the race, he finished well, stayed true to the end. Um, that there's this gift to my sister and I, to our children, his 6 grandchildren, and uh, and now his great grandchildren also benefit from his godly life. Yeah, there's joy in that. But but I miss my dad. I want him. That was 13 years ago. maybe at least once a week, something happens. And just out of habit and desire, I think, oh, my dad would like to see that too. Um, when I'm with my grandkids, um, one of them is the youngest, is a mechanic. He can take things apart and put them together. Things that are broke that I wouldn't try to fix, he fixes, and all that. Just like my dad was a mechanic, and I'd like for him, and my grandson is named after my father, so I'd like for the two of them to be together. They never met. So I have grief. I have grief, but I'm not to grieve for my father. I think it's permissible. I think it's healthy for me to admit that my life was more full when my father was alive and in it. And his absence is a continuing loss, an irreplaceable loss for me. And now, as of like 2.5 years ago, my mother also. That these are irreplaceable losses for me. There is grief. Um, Augustine is reacting to his, he thinks, succumbing to overwhelming grief in his youth because of his friend when he was about 20. Uh, and his friend, by the way, was converted at the last minute, was baptized at the last minute. And Augustine wasn't. That was actually a division. Their last words with each other were not in agreement. I think that was part of his grief. But if the friendship is, if our friendship is in part helping each other to be more and more like Christ, that the Spirit is using us within a friendship to help the other conform to the image of Christ. That's what God has predestined us all to be like Jesus. When the person dies and is with Jesus and becomes more fully like it, if that's what we've been working on all along, some joy probably is in order that the person graduated, if you will. What I don't appreciate is what you experience, um, that unwillingness to admit grief and loss, making as if the display of it is a witness against our faith. Yes, at a memorial service, I will talk about the resurrection. I will talk about us opening wide our arms here to let go of somebody we won't embrace again here. At the same time, as in heaven, our loved one is embraced and Christ will never let him go. The grief is ours, but not for our friend. It is for ourselves and it's appropriate. And I think what I want to say in the final analysis about all this is Jesus stood by the tomb of Lazarus and wept. When John writes the gospel, he doesn't feel he needs to explain that. He, the Pharisees look on and they say, see how much he loved him. It's just obvious why a person would weep at the death of a friend. Friend died, Jesus wept. Um, uh, that needs to balance, if you will, Augustine's firm statements about the joy.
Yes. Yes, thank you for sharing that, Jerry. And I follow your train of thought, and I think that the one doesn't exclude the other, and it shouldn't exclude the other, because
That's wise.
From my perspective, when my dad passed away 8 years now ago, I still miss him. I experience the exact same thing that you mentioned. Every now and then, a small thing here and there will remind me of him, and I would say to myself, "Well, my dad would love that." But then again, I counterbalance that with a faith and hope that he is with the Lord Jesus in heaven at the moment, and that I will see him one of these days. Uh, and grief is a very helpful thing that God has created. In my perspective, I mean, it helps with creating humility and remembering death. and making the most of things, and at least thinking about the mistakes one has done with a relationship that he's no longer able to entertain, and trying not to replicate that with other people. Last side commentary on a personal note. There's an Elvis Presley song. I don't know if you've come across it, called Milky White Way. That's a song that I absolutely love, and it's about grief. In the second verse, he sings, well, in the first verse, it's about Elvis joining the heavenly choir one of these days. The second verse is he's meeting his mother and shaking her hand when he gets home one day. And then the third verse is meeting God the Father and God the Son and telling them all about his troubles on earth. It's a brilliant song. Absolutely, absolutely brilliant. Shall we get to my last question? Because I'm conscious of the time and I've been keeping you all morning long talking to this random Bulgarian guy from this random Bulgarian Christian organization. I know it's weird, but I appreciate you spending the time.
I gave a note to my wife and said, I know you thought I'd never amount to anything, but I want to let you know I'm internationally known now.
Yes.
There's
So
there's one guy there's one guy in Bulgaria who has heard of
also,
me.
first time speaking in front of a Bulgarian audience. So
That's right.
exclusively for Freedom for All's podcast channel.
Yes.
Thank you for that. So I wanted to bring the subject of, well, what you started with in the beginning of our conversation, topic of living in one spirit. I've been hearing that term many times in my years in, well, being in the church, both in the United Kingdom while I was living there and in Bulgaria. We should all strive to be in one spirit, somewhere in St. Paul's writings, of course. But after I read your article, I can present the argument. I can say the argument that I've never actually seen that in practice to the level, to the degree that Augustine and his friends have done it. And let me open up another quote from the article to illustrate all of that. So you say that whatever day, meaning Augustine and his friends would decide, they would decide on it and live it out together. Their conversions to the Christian faith, though recorded as the work of God within individuals, were within a short space of time. So all of them are going through the exact same, well, identical cycles in their spiritual development. Carrying on, some of their baptismal dates were shared. The calls to ordain ministry occurred one right after another as well, with Augustine leading the way. Is an overstatement, but nearly everyone who went to kindergarten with Augustine became a bishop. It's almost unbelievable.
Yes. Yeah. You think of a parallel, a couple things. When Jesus calls his disciples, the Gospels um, give it every appearance that it happened within a short period of time. That at the start of his ministry, after the time of temptation, he calls 12 to follow him. And it gives the impression that this happened over just a very few days. It might have been longer than that, but it gives the impression of it. Well, they have a shared experience. They all know the same amount about Jesus, which is very small. And they all are asked to do the same thing, to leave everything behind and follow. And uh, though friendship is not the vocabulary of the Gospels, at the Gospel's end, and Jesus commissions them, especially in John 17, what is to be most characteristic of them is that they love each other. What makes a disciple is the ability to make another disciple. I know I'm a disciple of Jesus because I'm busy making other disciples, preaching the good news, witnessing in my life, encouraging people to know Christ and building them up when they do. That's what makes me a disciple. I make disciples. But what makes me known as a disciple of Jesus is that I love the other disciples. So this mark of mutual affection, of friendship, nobody's lording it over the other, but of equals, of friendship. That's what marks us as followers of Jesus. That motivates people like Augustine and others through the ages. It motivated um, the monastery system. Yeah, there were examples of people who went out in the desert by themselves and had, uh, by extraordinary lives, had impact.
Yes.
But the greater impact was done by men and women gathering together in close-knit societies, committing to each other to do the good thing, to work and to pray, to evangelize, to teach, whatever their calling was, and to do this together. And I'm a Protestant, and so monastery life is um, not, not part of our culture. Um, but the idea of pastors, this article that you read in Theology Matters was a chapter in a book called The Pastoral Rule, in which I and two friends, with looking at important people in history, tried to convince our contemporary fellow pastors of there's a way that pastors should live, that we should be thoughtful and studious. And so there's some examples of that, and a couple examples of we should do our work together. Well, I'm a pastor. I'm 72 now, retired, but I was a pastor for 45 years. I could do almost all of that by myself within my church, not with other pastors. Now, I'm a Presbyterian, so the pastors and the elders in an area get together and do ordinations, and some of our work is together. But we're so alone. And then we begin to like it because being alone means to be free. Uh, and we like freedom even from each other. That's not a virtue, that's a vice.
Mm.
Um, and the person who's free by himself, I think I would argue, isn't all that free. A person who is free with others is more fully free. But we resist that. So a lot of my time has been spent bringing people together and telling them this is what the greats have done. Again, I'm a Presbyterian, so I'm a Calvinist. Not everybody needs to do that, but John Calvin did this, called the Company of Pastors. That a couple of times each week, all the pastors in Geneva, where he would gather together as equals. Yeah, John Calvin is the first among equals. It'd be intimidating to be in a room with him and be asked to read your sermon in front of him. That would be scary. But that's what they were doing. One of them would read their sermon. They all be on the same text, would read their sermon, I think on Thursday mornings. And then they would all comment on it. Well, that's a scary thought for a pastor to have 20 other pastors in the room comment on your sermon. But it would also make me a better preacher, knowing I had such a rigorous audience who would comment and help me to make it better. Then what also made it challenging is the congregations wanted in on it. So there'd be a big audience of a couple hundred people, though there'd be this company of pastors.
Mm.
But the congregations would witness the pastors being on the same page, agreement on things human and divine, and with an affection for and kindness toward one another. They would witness this friendship in the company of pastors. And when you ask Augustine, you ask Calvin, you ask these other greats along the way, um, gee, how did you do this all by yourself, this great intellect of yours? They would all answer, all by myself. I was with people. Luther, his table talks, every meal, every evening was shared with others through the evening when they talked about these matters. And yeah, Luther was probably more bold than some of his friends, and so his name stands out. And Calvin certainly was very bright, and so maybe that's why he stands out. Um, Still, they don't think they did these things alone. And I think about the way, I have a PhD and I have 4 graduate degrees. All of that was done by myself. By yourself, go to the library. By yourself, do the research. By yourself, do the thinking. By yourself, do the writing. By yourself, be accountable. to some faculty members for what you've done. And our training to think, when we think most rigorously, we develop it as an individual enterprise. Yes, always I'll be responsible for my own thoughts, coming to my own conclusions. But I don't think it's designed that I would do that alone. I think it's designed that I would do that best if I did it with friends.
Definitely. It's an essential element of Christianity, isn't it? Nobody gets saved alone, in a sense. Pastor Andrews, thank you very much for your time and effort in this conversation. That's much appreciated. There's a lot to unpack, and I'm sure our audience would love what we talked about. And you're cordially invited to join us as a guest in future episodes as well, where we can talk about other subjects. I will check out the book that you mentioned, where this article is part of. Maybe we'll find something else there that we can talk about. I'm sure of that. If you're okay with that, we'd love to have you on.
All right. Well, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity. It was a joy. It's a joy to know that somebody has read what I've written, somebody other than my mother.
It's getting widely read in Bulgaria. We're getting popular now.
All right. Bye-bye.
Jerry, thank you. Take care.
God bless you.
God bless you. Speak soon.